Okay, this is going to be a video for Wednesday, February 27th. We just finished up the Atlantic Theater as well as the Holocaust. So now we're going to pick up with the Japanese side, the Pacific Theater, which, as a reminder, this is happening simultaneously with the rest of the Atlantic Theater. So we're going back to after Pearl Harbor in early 1942. So in the Pacific, the U.S. was largely the country to challenge Japan's expansion. We said that Britain and Soviets were mainly tied up with Europe, so not a lot of those guys go out and really fight the Japanese. So it's mainly left to the United States to deal with them. After Pearl Harbor, Japan achieved much control over East Asia and Southeast Asia because basically nothing was stopping them any longer. So if you look here, I don't know how well you can see this map, but all this area in yellow represents all the territories they take over. So they're going to take over a huge chunk of China, various territories and colonies of Southeast Asia. Like we said before, Britain, France, these guys who own these colonies couldn't defend them. So all these islands and territories get taken over way far out away from the mainland, which they're going to peak out in territorial expansion by about May of 1942. So I'm going to give you a list of places they take over. You don't have to know them all, but I'm just going to list them out. The Japanese the Japanese occupied areas like Korea, East China, the Philippines, Burma, Malaya, French Indochina, Dutch East Indies, and a lot of the various islands around the Pacific Ocean all the way to Midway. So essentially the Japanese are trying to take over as many territories as possible, and they're making their way down to Australia. Australia's right here at the bottom of this map. After they take part of New Guinea, they're going to try to make their way to Australia, and then we're going to stop them here at Coral Sea. So Coral Sea is an important battle. It takes place here in May of 1942, Coral Sea. And so this is actually the first modern-day naval battle because this is fought with aircraft carriers. Neither ships see each other in this battle. So you have the two sides fight each other. The ships never see each other. It's just the airplanes, and the airplanes attack each other's ships. But the battle itself is an important battle because it marks the first time the Japanese lost. So the Japanese just took over territory after territory throughout that entire period. We engaged them some in that 6-month period from December of 1941 till May, and essentially America lost several of those battles as well as all those other territories as well too. So Coral Sea was the first time you had the Japanese advances stopped, but also the first time they lost a major battle once the war began. It's also worth noting that we do lose the Philippines around this time period. It's right before Coral Sea. We also lose the Philippines. Famously, General Douglas MacArthur, who was the commander there, had to evacuate, and he said when he left, "I shall return." And then years later, he does come back and actually does return. And there's a big famous press conference and thing that he says with all that too. But we lost Philippines in the meantime as well to the Japanese. That resulted in the Bataan Death March, spelled Bataan, Bataan Death March. In the Bataan Death March, you see thousands of Filipinos and captured Americans are basically marched to these camps and towards executions after the fact. So we lost a lot, and so Coral Sea was important because we finally stopped them. And you can see it up on the screen, Coral Sea. The next battle is even more important, though. That's going to be Midway. So Midway is considered the turning point battle. So after suffering a loss here at Coral Sea, the Japanese decided to steam for their aircraft carriers towards Midway to try to sneak attack us, kind of like Pearl Harbor. But thankfully, the U.S. Navy was able to decipher that they were coming. So we knew they were coming. So instead of them attacking us by surprise, we attacked them by surprise. So our planes sneak attacked them on their route to Midway, which is going to take place in June of 1942. So we do heavy damage to them. We're going to take out several of their aircraft carriers as well as many airplanes and other ships they have. So at this point, they're going to have a huge blow to their Navy going forward. This is the turning point battle because it marks the end of the Japanese expansion. So Midway is the turning point battle because it marks the end of Japanese expansion. And so after this point, we're going to go on the offensive. So this is kind of like Stalingrad, where now we're going to remain and stay on the offensive going forward. And we're going to begin a campaign of island hopping. So our strategy from Midway onward is island hopping. Island hopping is where we're going to attack strategic islands to try to get close to Japan. So if you look at the map here, we don't want to attack and take over every single territory, then take Japan. That would take forever and it would take a lot of manpower. So the goal was basically to take over certain islands that were less defended and kind of isolate the ones that are more heavily defended. That way it doesn't become too much of a resource drain. So we're going to only go after certain places. But the goal is to get very close to Japan so we can launch attacks and fight inside of Japan itself. So that's island hopping, where we begin to go in the offensive in general. So we have two important commanders here in the Pacific Theater, much more of a Navy presence. So we have Admiral Chester Nimitz. Admiral is like the Navy rank like a general. So Admiral Chester Nimitz is going to be in charge of the Navy attacks in the Pacific during World War II. And then our general in charge of all our attacks in terms of land forces will be General Douglas MacArthur. So here you see Nimitz right here. Here you see, and I know it's not that great of a clarity, but here you see Douglas MacArthur. And I'll show you the slide again when I get back tomorrow. But make sure you know both these guys. MacArthur, as we said, was the guy who had evacuated out of the Philippines and eventually does come back and returns. So you'll notice here that we jump from Midway in June of 42 to the next major battles, which is Leyte Gulf, October 44. So you have a 2-year gap. There's actually several battles that take place between 42-44 during the island hopping campaign, but you don't have to know all those battles, so don't worry about them. So just know that there are several battles. Again, you'll kind of see some of this at the World War II Museum come later this year. But the next major battle we're going to jump to is Leyte Gulf. So October 44, MacArthur is going to finally come back to the Philippines and retake it. So he retakes the Philippines from the Japanese. There's this big thing where he gets off the boat and then has a conference later that day and says, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." So it's this big celebration. But not long after that, you're going to have a giant naval battle called Leyte Gulf. Leyte Gulf is the largest naval battle ever in human history. Basically, the Japanese throw every ship in their navy at us at Leyte Gulf. Leyte Gulf is the Gulf right off the coast of the Philippines. So they throw a massive navy attack at us. We have our navy along with some British ships as well too, and Australian ships. Big massive attack that takes place here at Leyte Gulf. The Japanese navy will lose and will be virtually destroyed in this battle. So this is a massive defeat for the Japanese. So their navy no longer plays a factor in this war. However, they still have plenty of planes, so they'll still be able to attack us going forward. Just they won't have really much of a navy to speak of after this point. Leyte Gulf is also important because this is the first time the Japanese use kamikaze attacks. This is the first time the Japanese use kamikaze attacks. Kamikaze means divine wind. The kamikaze attacks, they believe that they should sacrifice themselves and attack American or Allied ships. So you have to kind of think about the different philosophies of honor here in Japan versus like Europeans and Americans. You know, in a European or American war, it's very normal, very honorable for once you're defeated to basically give up, surrender, go to jail, get released hopefully eventually. Very normal, right? If it's just obviously you're not going to win, you're going to give up. Japanese culture is a lot different, where they have a higher regard for honor in their family, going back to like samurai and those kind of things. In fact, if a samurai leader or general lost in the battlefield, he would commit suicide after the battle ended. So that mentality kind of carries over here to World War II, where now they're getting more desperate. And this is only a year out from ending the war, and they're getting in America is getting pretty close to Japan itself. So their leaders are telling them to basically take their planes and dive bomb them or drive them into the ships, because it's much more honorable to die in battle than to come back a failure or to have lost, or even worse, to be captured. So you're going to see the first use of kamikaze attacks here, where over 1,000 planes will be used as kamikazes in this Battle of Leyte Gulf. Okay, so the last two big battles of the Pacific are Iwo Jima and Okinawa. So we look here. Here's Iwo Jima, which is really close to Japan, the main islands, and then here's Okinawa, which is actually inhabited by civilians. So they're very close to where you want to go. So the Japanese will place about 20,000 soldiers in Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was nothing more than a volcanic rock. Nothing very special about Iwo Jima at all, other than the fact that it was very close to Japan. it would provide a very vital airstrip for us to attack the Japanese with. But other than that, the island itself was very barren. But the Japanese put 20,000 soldiers there. So we decided to attack Iwo Jima. Our Marines and our Navy attack it in February of 45. And they fight tooth and nail. Basically, at Iwo Jima, that same mentality of I have to fight and bring honor to my family and not be captured or be taken prisoner. So a lot of these guys, as the battle goes on, will come charging out at American soldiers with next to nothing. They might have a makeshift spear or a sword in their hand and just get mowed down because they don't want to be captured or surrender. So of the 20,000 Japanese soldiers who were stationed on that island, when the battle was over, only 700 remained. So it was a big casualty loss for the Japanese because they felt like it was more honorable. And the thing is, the same thing is happening back in Japan itself. Like the emperor is telling their people basically, don't surrender, fight, and then, don't bring dishonor to your family. They're essentially trained civilians in Japan about how to fight in case the invasion does come. So there's no quit in terms of civilians or military when it comes to these battles. So the next big battle that comes after this is Okinawa. We have to do a massive naval assault first to get Okinawa. And then this is where the Japanese are going to use the largest amount of kamikaze attacks. So there's going to be a massive amount of kamikaze attacks on us at Okinawa. 1,900 kamikaze attacks will hit our ships, sinking 30 ships and destroying 300 planes. The USS Kidd, not in this battle, but around this time, is they actually have a kamikaze attack on it. If you ever go to the USS Kidd, what's kind of cool about the Kidd is that it had a kamikaze attack. The doctor on board was actually filming that day, and so there's a photograph of the plane just before it hits the ship. Obviously several people die when their kamikaze hit the ship, but it did not sink. Even the doctor who was taking the photograph survived the attack, but it was serious stuff. So they attack using their navy. They finally beat back the kamikazes. Now they have to go on the island. The island itself has over 100,000 people on it, both military and civilian. So we're having an attack. The military there, we witnessed civilians killing themselves. There was like footage and videos of civilians and killing themselves and their children. And so they just did not want to give up. It was more honorable to die than to be captured. So in Okinawa, 7,600 Americans die. So 7,600 Americans, like Marines, die in battle, but 110,000 Japanese die. So in Okinawa, 110,000 Japanese died. That includes civilians during that invasion. So basically, once we get Iwo Jima and Okinawa, those are the last steps. Once we have those two locations, those are the last steps before Japan. So at this point, you have President Truman, because Okinawa ends in June of 45. Truman and the other allies are now preparing for the worst, which is going to have to be an invasion of Japan. So we have now two strategic entry points with airstrips here from Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And so we're going to go into Japan next. But no one really wants to think about that. Like Winston Churchill was predicting that if we went to Okinawa and did an invasion, went to Japan and did an invasion, you would have like 250,000 British soldiers die, 500,000 Americans die, and probably over 2 million Japanese die. And that includes civilians because, like we said, they were prepared to fight back or resist us or commit suicide if we were to come into the area. But obviously, that doesn't happen. We never actually do invade Japan because of the atomic bomb. So let's talk about the atomic bomb. So before I do that, what you also have to understand, too, is that we were also kind of bombing Japan like we had been Germany. We started firebombing Japan before the nuclear bomb was used. We actually firebombed Tokyo and areas around Tokyo, the capital. And these firebombs are just like what it sounds like, create these massive fire attacks on these different areas. The firebombs themselves killed over 100,000 people before the nuclear bombs go off. And there's obviously, and that's just around Tokyo. There's other places too, but I mean, it's very bad in terms of how badly we're beating them. But here's the thing, even though we keep attacking them, they don't surrender. They keep fighting on, which is one of the reasons why we end up using the atomic bomb itself. So let's talk about the background of the atomic bomb. So the project to create the atomic bomb started right around the time the war started, called the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project starts, top secret project, 1942. The leading scientist involved in this was J. Robert Oppenheimer. J. Robert Oppenheimer was the leading scientist involved in making this bomb project. No one really knew about it. Like Truman, the vice president, didn't find out about the bomb project until the day he became president, once FDR died. Very closely guarded secret. At its peak, the project hired about 600,000 people in America to work on this, but not everybody who was working on it realized what they were working on. They did a lot of research around the bomb, but not necessarily knew what it was all going to be used for eventually. So it's worked on for several years, and then finally they have a successful test in July of 45. So right kind of before the attack on Japan, there's a successful test out in the desert in the United States with one of the bombs. So Truman now has a decision to make about whether or not to use this bomb or not, or do we have the moral right or the ability to use this. So this leads us to the Potsdam Ultimatum. Truman in July of 45 was meeting with the other Allied leaders at Potsdam, Germany. So they were in Potsdam, Germany, kind of talking about some of the end of the war objectives and so forth. So at the Potsdam conference, when they were meeting, before the meeting started, they all assumed they were going to be invading Japan by the end of the year. In fact, there was a planned invasion to take place by November of 45. Well, right in the middle of the conference, Truman learns about the bomb's success. So he kind of talks it over with the other allies and says, we're going to give them an ultimatum. So they give Japan what's referred to as the Potsdam Ultimatum, where basically they say surrender or face total and utter destruction. So surrender or face total and utter destruction. Keep in mind, they have no idea what that means. They've never seen an atomic bomb ever before. But essentially all the generals in America, for the most part, all believe that we should use this bomb against the Japanese. So the Japanese Emperor, Tojo, all these guys, they don't give up, they don't surrender. And so as a result, on August 6th, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped over Hiroshima. So that's going to be August 6th, 1945. I don't know how well you can see these pictures, but here's the two different mushroom clouds for the two different bombs. Here you see the bomber plane before it takes off. This is a recreation of the two bombs. This is the bigger bomb, Fat Man, which was dropped over Nagasaki, and Little Boy, which was dropped over Hiroshima. So here on the map, you can kind of see these two cities are at the kind of the bottom part of the island. You have Hiroshima, you have Nagasaki. Anyway, it's going to instantaneously kill the first bomb about 70,000 people. The first bomb was also mainly targeting military people. And by the end of the year, you're going to have more than that die from radiation poisoning and other wounds from the attack. Well, at that point, we basically asked, we give the ultimatum again. Japan doesn't respond again. And so on August 9th, we use our second bomb, which is going to be over Nagasaki. So the second bomb will be used over Nagasaki on August 9th. This one kills about 60,000 people. And again, civilians are killed as well. And then by the end of the year, after all the radiation and all the wounds, people succumb to wounds and those kind of things, you have over 200,000 people die from the two attacks. And just these cities are wiped out. There's radiation poisoning there for years after this. And so there's going to be a prolonged period of suffering. So after seeing the two attacks, the emperor says that's enough and basically calls for the surrender, like basically accepts the ultimatum after the second bomb goes off. So even though they surrender in mid-August, they won't officially surrender until September 2nd. So September 2nd is regarded as VJ Day, or Victory in Japan. So that's the formal day that Japan signs the surrender documents on the USS Missouri off the coast of Japan. And Douglas MacArthur was actually there to help sign our side and help end the war for their side as well too. The kind of the big result of this as well is what kind of happens to the Tojo and these other guys and the emperor. Like most of the leadership will all be tried. Tojo and a lot of the top guys will be executed, but the emperor, they don't execute. So they kind of rule that the emperor didn't have that much of an influential role in the war itself. So the emperor was allowed to stay and be alive and remain emperor, but he had to lose his god status. So he was no longer regarded as a living god after this war ended. Okay? So we're going to stop there. We'll be able to do the rest of this on Thursday. The test will be Friday. So have a good day, and the sub should hopefully have some videos